Obesity is arguably the biggest health hazard in the Western world. Over half the people watching this program tonight are overweight. This epidemic affects 3 times more adults and children today than it did even 20 years ago. And obesity-related illnesses such as heart disease, diabetes, cancer now claim more than 300,000 lives a year. And the estimated $200 billion cost to the healthcare industry continues to rise, despite aggressive efforts to educate Americans about healthy diets. So what are we doing wrong? A cover story in New York Times Magazine has launched a new debate on whether we really know what diet is best for us. And joining us tonight is Gary Taubes, who wrote that provocative piece, What If It's All a Big Fat Lie? Gary, welcome. He'll be joined by Dean Ornish, author of the New York Times bestseller Eat More and Weigh Less, a wonderful book, who has led a crusade with the low-fat diet as an alternative and a wellness-building diet. And finally, Dr. Barbara Howard, the chair of the American Heart Association's Nutrition Committee, which is responsible for shaping much of our nation's official dietary guidelines. Welcome to all of you. Gary, obesity is a big problem. And you would think that we would figure out what diets are good for us before we understand subtleties of immunology and genetics. Why is it that we can't really agree on dietary recommendations?
Well, a couple major issues. First of all, there are 2 divergent camps here that sort of do agree. There's the medical establishment that for 25 years has been saying eat less fat, we'll have less heart disease and less obesity and less diabetes. Unfortunately, we don't have less heart disease, less obesity, and less diabetes. So that brings us to the second camp, which are I call them the low-carbohydrate diet doctors, which say it's not the fat that makes you fat, it's the carbohydrates that make you fat, and they recommend eating less fat. And they're Dr. Atkins, Barry Sears, Sugar Busters. So there's 2 divergent camps, and the disagreement comes about because the science is surprisingly complicated. The human body is incredibly complicated. All people are different. Diseases are divergent in different people and their genetic elements and physiological elements and lifestyle elements. And when you actually get around to trying to test it, you end up with this morass of confusing and conflicting data out of which people can pick just the elements they want to support their preconceived opinions. And that sometimes makes the particular researcher look very sure that he knows the answer or she knows the answer, but unfortunately that's not how you do good science.
Now, Barbara, you're responsible for creating documents that we as physicians propagate, publicize among our patients, and shift the way people eat every time we see them in our offices. Now, Gary's written an article that argues that in many cases there are issues beyond pure science that have shaped the recommendations we make. This is a wonderful document that is from the Surgeon General's office, which again based on American Heart Guidelines. How is it the American Heart makes decisions on these important issues?
Well, it isn't just the American Heart Association. If you look at the guidelines that have come out in the last 5 years, from American Heart, from American Cancer Society, from the American Diabetes Association, and from the National Academy of Sciences, all with different nutritionists and researchers involved, they're surprisingly consistent in their recommendation for moderate fat, eating plenty of fruits and vegetables and whole grain products.
Gary, let me provoke you. This is a heart that's removed from a patient as part of a big operation called a heart transplant. And this organ, as you look at it, is covered with fat. Now, one of the reasons that organized medicine, I think, has believed that fat's not good for you is when you look at these kinds of organs that you've removed, pathologic organs, you come to the conclusion that maybe it's something about that fat's not good for you. What did you find when you looked at the real data on whether or not fat is the problem?
Well, this is the issue. I mean, certainly body fat, the fat on that heart is the problem, and that's one thing we all agree here. The question is what causes that fat. And when you go back, and this is one thing, all those expert committees at the American Heart Association, the American Diabetic Association, the American Cancer Society, they like to say, well, let's look at the data today, but they often don't go back 40, 50 years to see whether what they're building on is a solid foundation of good science or a house of cards. And when you go back as far as the 1950s to see what kind of science built this structure on which everyone supposedly agrees, you find out that we don't really know what aspects of the diet cause the body fat. We know that if you eat too much, you eat more calories than you burn, you'll get fat, but we don't know what aspects of the diet. The science doesn't actually show definitively what aspects of the diet would lead us to eating too much or would make it easier for us to get heavier. Those are the issues that we have to...
Dean, what are the long-term studies on diet? What has it really shown us?
Well, I'd like to come back to the point of what we do agree on and what those long-term studies or short-term studies do show, because, you know, in response to your question, we have to eat. It's just a question of what. And so I think we have to give the best advice based on what we currently know. Now, I actually think there's a lot that we agree on, and clearly there are things we don't agree on. But let's start with what we do. Let me throw some ideas out and tell me if I'm wrong. I think we all agree that trans fatty acids are not helpful for you. Is that a fair statement?
Probably.
So what are trans fatty acids?
Trans fatty acids are what you find if you look at a food label. And by the way, the FDA is likely to say that manufacturers will have to disclose how much trans fatty acids. But a surrogate for that is if it says hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated, then it probably has a lot of trans fatty acids. And the reason that food manufacturers use those is it increases the shelf life of the products, although it may decrease the shelf life of the people who buy them. And so, you know, hydrogenation simply means you are turning something that's less saturated into more saturated, which in turn is more likely to cause your the kind of things that you saw in that heart. Now, another thing I think we'd all agree on is that omega-3 fatty acids are likely protective, at least in terms of reducing the incidence of sudden cardiac death and stabilizing the electrical rhythm of the heart. Is that something we can all agree on?
So how do you find omega-3 fatty acids?
You get them in either flaxseed oil or fish oil or fatty fish, the deep water, cold water fish like salmon, mackerel, halibut. You don't need very much of them. Just about 3 grams a day will provide you all that you need. And I think most people should be taking them because they're so protective. I think we also agree that randomized controlled trials are better than uncontrolled studies, you know, in terms of the rigor of science. I presume that's not something we're going to debate. That fruits and vegetables have a number of things in them that are protective, you know, phytochemicals, bioflavonoids, carotenoids, retinols, isoflavones, genistein, licopene. There's a whole alphabet soup that may have
At the risk of sounding heretical, one of my favorite things to do.
I can't imagine why you would ever sound heretical.
The key words in all these things, again, you know, Lord knows I don't want to tell anyone not to eat their fruits and vegetables, but it's always likely protective, likely. You know, trans fats are likely to be bad. And again, the reason we have to say likely is because they'll do laboratory studies and you can isolate factors in the foods that seem to be protective against cancer, for instance, in test tubes. You can do comparative studies where you take 2 groups of people and you say the groups who eat more margarine, more trans fatty acids seem to have more heart disease than the people who don't. But these are all associations, and they don't answer the actual questions, which are how do you find out who's going to live longer? How much longer are you going to live? How much of a change are you going to get by changing your diet dramatically? Like there's this push to eat a Mediterranean diet. And I'm sure a Mediterranean diet's very healthy, especially if you live in the Mediterranean. You get to wander through the fields of Greece all day long. Maybe it is healthy, but to do the study to find out...
You're wandering through different kinds of fields of Greece, but that's another story.
Let me interrupt here because I think we're getting away from the main point that needs to be made, that there is generally agreement among people in this field, and what I think has got people confused is the extremes. I think people taking one extreme and trying to present a simple answer to what's a complicated question. We don't have any easy way to lose weight, and people don't want to hear that.
Again, we don't know if we don't have an easy way to lose weight.
Oh, yes, we do.
Why don't you spend a few moments just telling us what a high-fat, high-protein diet is about? I know you've experimented on this yourself.
Well, this is, let me again backtrack so that we
don't...
don't...
That's not an experiment. A
No,
one-person
but I do think we owe it to the viewers to understand what these different diets really are about and what the arguments are so we can pick at them a little.
Actually, let me just establish what I said in this article. So that's another grounds on which we can debate or not. But again, for 25 years, we've been pushing a low-fat dogma. It said, eat less fat. First, it said, eat less total fat. And you'll have less heart disease, less cancer, and you'll weigh less. Then
well, that's not exactly true. This started because there's incontrovertible evidence that saturated fat is bad. And that is well established in long-term trials. And therefore, the first approach, which was mistaken, was thinking if we made people cut all their fat, they would cut their saturated fat. And that was the genesis of that, and that is why the recommendations have now all migrated to moderate fat, recognizing the polyunsaturates, as Dr. Ornish pointed out, are valuable, and that we really want people to focus on saturated and trans fatty acids.
Let me just focus for a second on the article, just so I can get that on the table, and then I want to go back and forth, and we can pick at it. So finish. I know it's all provocative, and many people in the medical community got their blood pressures raised tremendously by the article. So explain what the point was.
We're back to 25 years of low-fat dogma. It has changed over the years. As Barbara said, it started as total fat in an effort to get people to cut saturated fat. I disagree that the saturated fat data is incontrovertible, but we may always disagree on that. It said that that's the way to lose weight, and over the past 25 years, people have found it excruciatingly difficult to lose weight. The evidence that fat causes cancer, which was part of this original packet, has pretty much evaporated. There's still some evidence that red meat could cause colon cancer, but that's debatable as well. The contrary opinion, the alternative hypotheses, which has been around for a couple hundred years, is that we get fat because we eat carbohydrates like pasta, potatoes, bread. They used to be called simple carbohydrates. Now the terminology is changing to adjust to the fact that a lot of people think maybe these starches, as my mother called them, are not quite so good for us. And we get fat because we eat refined sugars and flours, and that these could be the causes of obesity. And this was pretty much the dogma through the 1970s. And then as the community decided that it's the fats that cause heart disease, they also decided it must be the fats that cause obesity and the fats that cause cancer. And unfortunately, that data had never really, it was never there to begin with. And it's never, again, when people go on low-fat diets, when they cut their fat and cut their calories, they find it excruciatingly difficult to lose weight. And most randomized controlled trials show that it doesn't work. So the counter-argument is that, again, this dogma that existed through the 70s, that it was the carbohydrates, and there's something about eating these starches and refined carbohydrates of sugar and flour that make people hungrier and make them heavier and maybe even affect their heart disease risk. And the point I was making in the article was that that data was never really looked at because it was so heretical. If you said maybe it's the carbs, then you're attacking the entire low-fat dogma. And the reason I brought Dr. Atkins and his diet revolution into it is because he was the extreme example of this diet. He said, basically, cut out all refined carbohydrates entirely, cut out all starches entirely, and you could live on, in the beginning of the diet, mostly or almost exclusively meat and dairy products, and then after a few weeks or a month, you move to meat, dairy products, and vegetables, some fruit. And that was an extreme version of this position that it's the carbohydrates that make you fat and maybe give you heart disease. And as it turns out, in the past few years, people have actually started doing randomized controlled trials of the Atkins diet versus an American Heart Association low-fat diet. And at least so far, and this data have been reported at conferences and not yet published, but at least so far, after 6 months to a year, they find out that lo and behold, as Atkins has said, it's not that hard to lose weight on his diet, and that the cholesterol profile, if anything, improves compared to an American Heart Association low-fat, low-calorie diet. So Atkins, to me, represents finally somebody's going to test this alternative hypothesis instead of ignoring it because, well, Lord knows if it turns out to be right, what does that say about what we've been telling patients for the past 25 years? Finally, it's being tested, and the tests so far show that there's a lot to it.
Now, Dean, you've actually, I think, been testing these dietary recommendations for some time. What insights do you have with the exact opposite style of diet, and specifically perhaps address some of the issues that Gary has raised about the feasibility of a high-fat diet?
Well, first of all, I agree with Gary that good science is important, but I would like Gary to hold those studies to the same standard that he's holding others. In other words, there are always things to criticize in any study, and that's why the process of peer review is so important. And we have published our studies over the last 25 years in the Journal of the American Medical Association, the New England Journal of Medicine, Circulation, the Lancet, the American Journal of Cardiology, because the whole process of peer review is based on the idea that you have to defend what you say. Now, part of the criticism that I have of Dr. Atkins and others is that they spent 30 years writing books claiming something is true, and then now they're finally starting to do the studies to see if it's true or not. And part of the concern that I have about this New York Times article is that unless you read it very carefully, many people have the idea that those studies are now proving that a high-fat diet is good for you, when I think the best that can be said for them is that they're doing studies, which I think is great. and that the best thing that can be said for what the data are, which still have not yet been published in a peer-reviewed journal, is that people can lose weight on an Atkins-type diet, and that their cholesterol levels don't go way out of range. But I think it's really important to not look at simply risk factors like cholesterol, but actual underlying heart disease, because that's the bottom line. The bottom line is not, does your cholesterol change? That's really only important to the extent of what happens to your arteries, and like the heart that you showed. Now, we found, and we used, ironically, these very high-tech, state-of-the-art measures like computer-analyzed coronary arteriography and cardiac PET scans and so on, to see what happens to people who eat this way and who make other simple changes like moderate exercise, meditation, and support groups. And others are looking at that too. In our studies, we found that the actual disease got better, and much more quickly than people had thought possible. The amount of chest pain or angina decreased by over 90% within a few weeks. People who literally couldn't walk across the street without getting severe chest pain.
What kind of diet is this again?
This is essentially a low-fat, whole foods, plant-based diet, and I'll come back to the diet in a moment. But I first want to just talk about the evidence, and then I'll talk about why.
Does the American Heart Association approve of a diet that low in fat?
We think that the person who can follow Dr. Ornish's approach and actually reduce the fat that much and replace it with whole foods, vegetables, fruits, and grains can certainly be healthy. Okay. What we worry about in lowering the fat that much is the average American who takes the fat away and goes and eats an Entenmann's cupcake.
You know, with complete agreement of that, I think all three of us would be in agreement that simple carbohydrates are not a wise food choice. But let me just first talk about
If they're not a wise food choice, why are they at the base of the food guide pyramid?
I didn't write the food pyramid,
and
I want to again
also
focus
our
on what we
guidelines
agree
are
on.
talking about whole grain products and carbohydrates coming from vegetables and fruits.
Now, I would
We're
really
not
like to
telling
just take a
people to
couple
eat
minutes
sugar.
to develop this argument, and then we can all discuss it if I can. We found that within a month, the blood flow to the heart improved. Within a year, even severely blocked arteries became measurably less blocked. After 5 years with NIH support, we found there was even more reversal after 5 years than after 1 year. This was a randomized control trial. The control group, who were making more moderate changes, got worse and worse. And looking at the blood flow to the heart, we found that those moderate changes in blockages caused a 300% improvement in blood flow. And 99% of the patients were able to stop or reverse the progression of their heart disease. This is what we published in JAMA. Now, equally important was a study done by Dr. Richard Fleming from Nebraska, and he took men and women who went on a diet similar to what I would recommend, and also people who went on an Atkins-type high-protein diet. And what did he find? What he found was that these are what are called system-IV SPECT scans looking at blood flow to the heart. And really, blood flow is the bottom line in heart disease, as you know. Red is good here. So on a diet, and these are representative scans, and this was published in a peer-reviewed journal. The blood flow improved on a, I don't know if you can see this, on a diet similar to what I would recommend. It actually worsened when people went on a diet similar to a high-protein diet, that was a high-protein diet, similar to what Dr. Atkins would recommend. And so when I say that you mortgage your health when you go on a diet like this, we now have scientific evidence, not simply looking at risk factors, but at the underlying disease. And so I don't dispute that people can lose weight on an Atkins-type diet. You can lose weight on any diet if you don't eat more calories than you burn, as Gary indicated. But how you lose weight, I mean, ironically, the reason that I wrote this book, Eat More, Weigh Less, was I thought it would encourage people to begin eating this way so that they would also improve their health in the process. You can lose weight on fen-phen or other things, but it's not good for you.
Dean, this is what I mean when I argue for good science in these fields. First of all, one of the sort of false comparisons here is Dean likes to set up his diet versus the Atkins diet. And as he says, his diet is very low fat, it's whole grains and fruits and vegetables. Could be healthy, who knows. It's also exercise, it's meditation, it's lifestyle changes, it's smoking cessation. So what he doesn't know, let's say a really well-controlled study, one of the first things you learn in science is isolate the independent variables. If he wants to say it's the fat, the low fat in the diet that's doing it, what you want to do is say, let's do this study where we have 40 people we've chosen at random on the low fat diet and 40 people on the high fat diet, and then if you get better, and they both have the same exercise, same meditation, same smoking cessation, then you could say, my diet's healthier than Dr. Atkins' diet. But otherwise, he doesn't actually know.
So, Barbara, why hasn't that study been done? I mean, the American Heart Association is the heart representative for the country.
These studies are extremely expensive, and there have been enough good studies done to support our moderate approach, which is looking at balanced foods, vegetables, fruits, grains, and lean meat and dairy products. I would challenge Gary strongly about the Atkins data, because it's well known that if a person eats a very high protein and a lot of fat, they become ketotic. As soon as you become ketotic, you lose fluid and you lose your appetite. So of course you get a short-term weight loss. But no one has ever shown, even in a non-randomized trial, that that can be sustained. But people have, wait, let me finish. Let me finish. You know, women are supposed to talk more, but you guys talk an awful lot.
Yeah, we do. Sorry.
That what has been shown is that high protein, the levels of protein that they include in that diet, are absolutely detrimental to the kidney and to the liver. They cause bone loss, very worrisome for postmenopausal women. And those diets have been used in children for many years who have epilepsy. And those children show definite cognitive dysfunction. Also, those diets contain
they
so
don't
much.
think as clearly.
That's
Those
right.
children are also children who have as many, they're intransigent childhood epilepsy. They have as many as 400 seizures a month. They're untreatable by drugs. They go on the diets, and the diets, I think it cures 33% of them, cures them.
These are epilepsy, and then they aren't able to think.
I need to respond to what Gary said, because, again, Gary, what puzzles me is why you have this double standard. You know, you're really good at pointing out the shortcomings of the kind of studies we do, and I will be the first to admit that this is not a perfect study. And yet, you accept so uncritically the fact that, I mean, no one has ever, Dr. Atkins has never published a single study in a peer-reviewed journal. Let me just, again, finish the point, which is that we did correlate grams of fat and changes in percent diameter stenosis, how much blockage in the arteries, after 1 year and after 5 years. And we found a dose-response correlation between that. In our more recent studies, looking at the effects of this kind of diet and lifestyle program on prostate cancer, we found the same thing again.
I'm just saying, all you've got to do is control for the dietary variable. You don't do it. What good science is not overinterpreting your data. As you said, maybe if people don't read my article carefully, they will get the wrong answer. If they read it carefully, you'll see you do not overinterpret your data. You do not say your studies say something they do not say.
Well,
and to do that is bad science.
I think I read your article very carefully, and your article tried to imply that the increased weight in this country was solely due to the recommendation to reduce fat in the diet, and that at the same time that was happening in the middle of last century and later part, we had much less physical activity in this country. No one's mentioning physical activity here, although Dr. Ornish certainly recommends it as part of his program. But you can look at the number of televisions that increased, the computers, the automobiles, and about 10 other correlates that correlate with that increase in weight in this country, as well as our dietary recommendations.
Why did it start in the early 80s?
Why did it's because that's when the actual N-Haynes study made the measurement.
No, the N-Haynes studies went from the 1960s. They started, the first one was in 1960, the second one was the late 60s, the third one was the late 70s.
What did the N-Haynes studies show?
The N-Haynes studies show that from 1960 to the end of N-Haynes 2, which was, I believe, 1978, the obesity in this country increased from about 12.8% to 14.3%. N-Haynes 3, and N-Haynes is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Surveys, in which they weigh individuals throughout the country so you can trust their data, because they're not calling people up and saying, how much do you weigh? Did you weigh more 10 years ago? They're weighing people, and then they're comparing the weights. These surveys take the N-Haynes 2, I believe, took 4 years, from 74 to 78. N-Haynes 3 started in the late 80s and took 6 years. And between those two studies, remember, it went from 12.8% in 1960, 14.3%, barely changed in those 20 years, and then it shot up to 22% by N-Haynes 3. And that's what people talk about when they're talking about the obesity epidemic.
But that's what proved my point, because the emphasis on saturated fat and the message of low fat started before that. But what really did change in the late part of the 20th century was the TVs, the computers, and the much more mechanized
Centers of Disease Control, which has, and I recommend you call Bill Dietz, who does these studies and runs this program at CDC. I just called him and I said, has exercise and activity levels changed? And what we don't have are data going back before the mid-'80s. So unfortunately, at the time the obesity epidemic starts, that's about the time the data starts. So you cannot establish trends with that. The data they have for the 1990s shows that physical activity levels staying constant and obesity continuing to climb. And we all know, if we're old enough to remember, which I think all of us are, that there was an exercise boom that started in the 1970s in this country. Remember, the first New York Marathon had 126 runners.
But what proportion of our country run marathons?
Well, the ones who aren't.
I'm talking about the average person.
I've got to say something here if I can. That's so clear to me and that kind of is getting obfuscated in all of this process. The amount of fat, the reason why people, I think, are gaining weight, I think is something that we'll all agree on. I want to try to keep coming back to what we can agree on here so that the viewers can come away with actually something that they can use. I think we all agree that simple carbohydrates are not a good choice for most people. And the actual amount of fat that people have been eating the last 20 years has actually, if anything, gone up a little. It's the percent.
It has not.
No, the percent. Now, Gary, let me finish. The percentage of calories from fat has gone down. The amount of grams of fat that people are eating has gone up. Yeah, you got to let me finish what I'm saying.
The percentage of calories has gone down. What had to go up?
Simple carbohydrates. Okay, that's what I'm trying to say. This is something I think we can all agree on. The reason that Americans are gaining weight is that they're eating too many simple carbohydrates. But the solution is not to go from simple carbohydrates to pork rinds and bacon. I would love to be able to tell you that bacon is a health food. It isn't. You know, I'd like to be able to tell you there's a Santa Claus. There isn't. I mean, I'm glad the show comes on late at night so I don't wreck anybody's family here. But
how do you know? I know this sounds absurd, okay? Because it sounds, in science, the history of science, once again, is full of commonsensical facts that turned out to be dead wrong when we did the science. The point of the article is we haven't done the science. You're certain. You use words like it proves. When you look at the data, it either isn't there or we just didn't do the experiments.
Is there a best diet for mankind?
I think there's a genetic variant. First of all, I think the science is there. In fact, one of the people that you quoted, David Ludwig, published an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association showing clearly that when you eat a diet that's rich in whole foods, you don't go from simple carbohydrates to pork rinds. What you do is go from...
Wait, come on. Protect Dr. Atkins
Gary, you've got to at least let me finish my sentences, okay?
Just stay honest, Dean. That's all I'm asking, okay?
I am staying honest.
Okay, well, try harder.
Any case.
And it would be great, you know, I think it's going to be helpful if we can try to let each other at least develop a point and then respond to it. Okay, it's just common courtesy.
Stay honest.
So, the goal is not to go from simple carbohydrates to bacon and pork rinds, which is what Dr. Atkins recommends, but to go from simple carbohydrates to whole foods or complex carbohydrates. Fruits, vegetables, grains, beans, soy products in their natural forms are rich in fiber. And when you eat a diet like this, it gives you a double benefit. You get full before you get too many calories because the fiber fills you up, and you absorb those calories more slowly. So when you eat white flour, white rice, sugar, and so on, they get absorbed quickly because you remove the fiber in the bran that slows their absorption. And so you get a rapid rise in blood sugar, you get an insulin spike, which lowers your blood sugar, but insulin also accelerates the conversion of calories into fat. I think we all agree with that. But if you eat a whole foods diet, fruits, vegetables, grains, beans, the fiber slows the absorption. So you get the benefits of a high-protein diet from the standpoint of not provoking an insulin response. But instead of mortgaging your health, as I was talking about earlier, you're actually enhancing it. Now, this is science. These are randomized trials that we've done. You know, the thing that's still puzzling to me is that you take, you know, certainly one can take a nihilistic position and say, you know, there's not enough science, nothing is ever really proven. But if you look at the preponderance of evidence, certainly from our studies, and you say, does a healthy diet and lifestyle cause these improvements? We found a 25-pound weight loss on average, and half of that was maintained 5 years later. We found that even severe heart disease begins to reverse in ways that we can measure. We found that men with early prostate cancer showed a reduction in their PSA levels. Now, these are incontrovertible facts. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't weaknesses in the study that we can talk about. But when you compare that to the fact there's not a single study that's been published in a peer-reviewed journal talking about the kinds of things that Gary is writing about, I don't understand why there's this double standard.
And let's focus on data that we do have. We know that the way you gain weight is you take in more calories than you burn. And those calories can be fat or they can be carbohydrate. The simple fact is that fat per gram has more calories than carbohydrate. So what you want to do is eat foods that fill you up before you exceed your calories.
Exactly.
Simple carbohydrates, the calorie-dense cookies and sweets, those are also very calorie-dense.
Pasta,
so we are trying, no, not all pastas, and there are good studies on that. But But we are trying to get people to eat less and be more active.
In the 1920s, there was a battle raging in physics between different theories of explaining why this table is solid. And the concept, in fact, inaugurated by Niels Bohr, one of the leaders of this research endeavor, was that of complementarity, that you could have two mutually exclusive phenomenon theories. They were both correct. Is it possible that for some people who have so-called syndrome X, which if you could define would be helpful, it might be actually better to have a high-fat diet, a higher fat diet anyway, than that argued would be beneficial by the American Heart Association?
Well, I think you make a good point in that human beings vary, and that in order for a diet to work for someone, especially if they're trying to lose weight, it's got to fit their preferences and their cultural eating habits. And so you're very right. There's a wide variety of diets that can be effective as long as the calories in don't exceed the calories out. I think the issue of insulin resistance has been greatly exaggerated. We do have very good randomized trials feeding people lower fat and higher fat diets. Their insulin resistance doesn't change. The only study that showed a difference was one that came out of Europe a couple of years ago, which varied the type of fat, and saturated fat seemed to be associated or lead to increased insulin resistance, and polyunsaturated fats to more insulin sensitivity.
Just define polyunsaturated and saturated fats.
Okay, saturated fats are what comes from the fat that you get in meat and dairy products and cheeses, things like that. Unsaturated fats come from plants and from fish. And we know, and there are actually very good studies from years ago that showed that replacing polyunsaturated fat with saturated fat lead to a decreased cardiovascular mortality. And Dr. Ornish cited the studies on fish and fish oil, which also showed lower cardiovascular disease.
There are some studies that have been done not as prospective randomized trials, but rather epidemiologic evaluations of different cultures. Dean, why don't you try to explain, if you could, why Japan, which has a 10% fat diet intake on average, and they have tremendous longevity. In fact, I believe both with men and women, the longest lifespans on the planet. And Crete, or other Grecian islands, which usually have 40% fat diets, so-called Mediterranean diet. How come they both have low heart disease rates?
Well, a Mediterranean diet is a better diet than a typical American diet. And if you look at the incidence of heart disease, breast cancer, prostate cancer, it's much lower. But it's even lower in Asian cultures, you know. And so to me, you say it's a better diet, but an optimal diet would be closer to an Asian diet. You know, it's only been in the last 20 years or so where you begin to see a number of overweight people in Asia. They're beginning to eat and live like us, and they're starting to die like us. But I want to agree with what both of them are saying about there isn't one right diet that's perfect for everyone. The Nobel Prize in Medicine, Brown and Goldstein discovered the cholesterol receptor, the LDL receptor, which binds and removes cholesterol from your blood. And the more receptors you have, the more efficiently your body can handle fat and cholesterol. And so some people, it's like a bell curve, like so many things in science. On one end of the spectrum, you've got the 90-year-old man or woman. You say, what do you eat? And they say, oh, I have 12 eggs for breakfast and a steak for lunch. You kind of go, well, maybe that diet's not that important. Look what they're eating. They're 90. Except everyone else who was eating such a rich diet and wasn't so efficient at getting rid of it never made it to 90. So you have a self-selected group in a way. On the other end of the spectrum are people who have heart disease. And what we found is that moderate changes in diet don't go far enough to reverse heart disease. No one has ever published a study. In fact, there are a number of serial arteriographic randomized controlled trials looking at the amount of blockages in the arteries, and they find that if you only reduce fat and cholesterol moderately, the disease still worsens. The arteries get more clogged. Maybe more slowly than if you made no changes, but it doesn't go far enough to stop or reverse it. But the good news is that even if you're on the inefficient end of that spectrum, in other words, you're not very good at getting rid of fat and cholesterol, like most people who have heart disease are, which is one reason they have heart disease, if you reduce your fat and cholesterol intake sufficiently, you're no longer, in a sense, saturating and downregulating those receptors. In simple terms, you're not eating more fat than your body and cholesterol than your body can get rid of, and your body has a remarkable capacity to begin healing itself if you stop what's causing the problem in the first place. And that's what we can actually measure. Now, to me, the burden of proof is on the high-fat, high-protein diet advocates to say, instead of saying that their diet can reverse heart disease, as Dr. Atkins has said on many occasions, where is the evidence? It's like, show me the data, because it's not there.
I have another answer for your first question about Japan versus Greece. They're both much more active than we are. And also, they eat less. They have smaller portion sizes, and their calorie intake doesn't exceed their...
You mentioned earlier that there was a study done on middle schoolers who had TV restriction and were able to correlate that with weight loss.
Yes, we were talking about children, and the most worrisome thing about this epidemic that Gary points out so aptly is that the children are also heavier in this country, and we really have to worry about the consequences of that. And people are really trying now to do studies in schools and figure out approaches to help these kids. The study that I know of that's the most effective, that was the most effective overall, was one run out of Stanford where the number of hours of TV watching was limited. And that was, in a randomized trial, led to weight loss in those children.
Gary, why does the Western diet cause heart disease, or do you think it doesn't?
Well, it appears to, but the question is what aspect of the Western diet, and then we get back to the same argument. Again, I sound like I'm repeating myself. For 30 years, we've said it's the fat, it's the fat, it's the fat. Well, we've gotten fatter, we've gotten more diabetes, and we have not had a reduction in incidence of heart disease while our cigarette smoking was decreasing. So you have to, it's just a question of, you know, Dr. Ornish and Barbara are sure that they know the answer. And I'm saying when you look at the data, there are huge questions, huge holes, and there is an alternative hypothesis.
Funny to me, it's you the one that appears to me to be sure that you have the answer.
We have viewers who can decide for themselves.
This is like herding cats.
I hope they do.
One of the challenges that we have as we give advice is the fact that we have to reduce theory to practice. We do this every day in our offices. People do this at their homes. The mothers, the real healers of our society, do this every day, and will watch the show and make decisions tomorrow morning on what their kids will eat. At the end of the day, we're going to have to make leaps of faith. And I think the argument you make is a very prudent one, that we should be careful what the underlying data is. But here are the experts. But how are we going to come to a conclusion if the experts can't agree?
Can we set this up as a hypothetical question? Let's just say we're living in an alternative universe. White is black, black is white, and suddenly, lo and behold, it turns out that it's the carbs and not the fat. And that the Atkins diet works miraculously. Chance, I mean, one chance in a million that this will ever happen, but let's just say it does.
Right, and the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus exist.
Exactly,
right?
they exist. What do you guys say?
What I say is that we have to focus on moderation, and that these kinds of extreme discussions just confuse people more. There are no simple answers. There's no magic bullet, and getting people to eat a balanced diet with a wide range of nutrients is the only thing that we all appear to agree upon.
Well, you know, I'm a scientist because I believe in the power of science to help sort out conflicting claims. And my mentor when I was at Harvard, Dr. Alexander Leaf, did a lot of the seminal work on fish oil. And I changed my recommendations based on that science. So if the science is there, I'll be the first to back it. But I want to, again, challenge a point that you keep making, which is a focal point of your article, which is a distortion of the truth. And forgive me for being so blunt. But you keep saying Americans have been told to eat low fat, they're eating less fat, and they're fatter than ever. But they're not eating less fat. They're eating the same amount of fat. The percentage of fat is lower because they're eating more simple carbohydrates. And why can't we all agree that simple carbohydrates may very well account
Actually, the data on the percentage of fat, first of all, the recommendations have always been for percentage of fat, and that has lowered. Okay. Second of all, the actual total amount of fat is very ambiguous because that data, that the fats that have risen, saturated fat consumption has come down, vegetable oils and added oils for salads has gone up according to the USDA. And if you read the USDA studies, what they say is that, yes, we are deep frying French fries more than ever, but that is the worst data because we throw out most of the oil after we're done deep frying the French fries. So if you actually read the USDA reports, it's actually quite likely that even that data is exaggerated, in which case total amount of fat is also coming down as well.
Wait a minute, Gary, come on now. I mean, you know as well as anyone that, and I have read those reports, and we're actually going to be collaborating with the USDA on trying to do some of these studies. But, you know, to say that French fries are not high in fat because you throw out the oil that
what
they're
I'm saying is
fried in is
when
crazy.
they discuss the amount of fat consumed,
Right.
the way they calculated it is they have to look at all the fat used, all the oils used in the deep fryer. So if you deep fry the French fries and you throw out the remaining oil at the end of the day, like when you add dressing to salad, it's not as though it all gets absorbed by the leaves. You leave a certain amount at the bottom. I'm just repeating what the USDA says, which is sticking to the data, which is what I'm trying to get you to do.
People are not eating less fat. They are eating more hydrogenated fats, which we all agree is not a good thing. And it leaves people with the wrong, for someone who's as careful as you are about not overstating findings, I think it would be a real disservice to people to leave them with the idea that people are eating less fat and they're fatter than ever.
Do you want me to read the sentence from my article where it says the percentage of fat in the American diet is decreasing?
I understand that.
Which means the absolute amount of carbohydrates is increasing.
Which we all agree on.
Gary, let me ask you a follow-up question. The area where there has been some research done, and this is a pet peeve for me, is the fact that when we look at public policy initiatives, we're often tremendously underfunded. But the pharmaceutical industry is adequately funded because they're willing to invest in patented products that might show a benefit. And there is a wealth of data now showing that cholesterol-lowering drugs have a benefit in reducing the incidence of fatal heart attacks and perhaps the incidence of heart attacks in general. With that in mind, if we know that a drug that lowers cholesterol, particularly LDL or bad cholesterol, is good for you, would you argue that diets that create that same endpoint would probably be beneficial as well?
Well, that's exactly what the government has done. Back in 1984, in the 70s to the early 80s, they spent probably close to $500 million trying to prove that people who ate more fat, more saturated fat, got more heart disease, and they failed. But what they did do is they showed that a drug that lowers cholesterol manages to lower heart disease risk. And they said if a drug that lowers cholesterol lowers heart disease risk, then a diet that lowers cholesterol should lower heart disease risk. So we're going to tell everybody to eat less fats because that's how they lower cholesterol.
And that statement just puzzles me because I am old enough to have been part of some of those discussions, and that was not the, you see, you're young, and I'm not.
Actually, I went
but
back to read
that was not the rationale, and that was not the line of thinking. And there were studies from both the States and Europe, and also more recent meta-analyses that clearly show that lowering saturated fat when it leads to lower cholesterol is associated with less cardiovascular disease.
Can we agree on one topic? I suspect the panel will come to the conclusion at the end of the day that if you're heavy, if you're obese, you have a higher incidence of heart disease. Right. Is it also true, therefore, that if you follow a diet, no matter what diet it is, that reduces your weight, you're better off than if you don't do a diet that loses your weight?
Absolutely not. That's exactly what this study showed, that when you go on a low-fat, on a high-protein, high-fat, Atkins-type diet, you lose weight. There's no question about it. But you mortgage your health.
And the problem
I'm aware of how that
is
study was
also
done.
you have to maintain the loss. And therefore, no one argues that while you're in the weight loss process, everything is going to go down, your lipids and your blood pressure. But you have to, at some point, start coming into equilibrium. And that's where the trouble begins.
Is it possible, and hypothetically in this wonderful universe that Gary tried to articulate earlier, that you could have a high-protein diet which was not composed of pork rinds and other fats that we would probably not want to take and give to our kids and what our mothers told us not to take, but nevertheless a high-fat, high-protein diet that might allow weight loss for some people, and at the end of the day, they may be better off.
And there's a way that you can go about that.
Except if they have kidney problems or any tendency to diabetes, because the protein load creates a tremendous metabolic stress where you and I are healthy, probably could do for 6 months, but a person who is heading toward diabetes, their kidneys really will suffer.
Gerald Reaven talked about Syndrome X, and that's something that's a cornerstone of what you're writing about, which I agree with. In fact, he and I debated at Stanford recently.
What is Syndrome X?
Syndrome X is something that about 25% of Americans have, where they really don't metabolize simple carbohydrates very well. So they tend to have high triglycerides, low HDL, high blood pressure. They're in increased risk for heart disease and perhaps other illnesses as well. So we tailor a diet. That's part of what we've learned over the course of doing our studies. I've become much more mindful over the last 25 years about the need to reduce the intake of simple carbohydrates in those patients who don't do well. If their triglycerides go up, for example, or they're, and so we do tailor diets, but, you can have them eating soy protein. They don't have to eat bacon and eggs. You can have them exercise more. The fish oil will help lower their triglycerides as well. And interestingly, I want to re-emphasize a point that I made earlier. We're not talking about risk factors, we're talking about disease. And when we measure the underlying heart disease using the state-of-the-art measures, even in people whose triglycerides went up a little or whose HDLs went down,
HDLs are the good
cholesterol, their LDLs went down by 40%, much more, they still showed reversal. Now, one of the reasons why cholesterol-lowering drugs work is not only because they affect your LDL cholesterol, they may affect inflammation like C-reactive protein and fibrinogen and Lp(a). These are just measures of inflammation, which is also a factor in heart disease. But we found that those also improve when you make these kinds of changes in diet that I recommend. In an article that came out last week in Preventive Cardiology, a peer-reviewed journal by Dr. Richard Fleming, put people on a diet like I would recommend, an Atkins-type diet, an American Heart Association-type diet, and they found that the markers of inflammation, the ones we just talked about, were by far the lowest in people who went on a diet like I recommend, and they actually got worse, every one of them, in people who went on an Atkins-type diet. So the more mechanisms we look at, the more, and we actually look at the underlying disease process. We found 2.5 times fewer cardiac events as well in this randomized trial that we did. We find that there's more reason to understand why eating this way is more helpful, and you can still tailor it within those guidelines.
Barbara, for the American Heart Association, if someone came to your, emailed you on your website and said, I have the choice between eating the diet at the proportions you desire, or I have a different diet, whether it's a super low carbohydrate or super high carbohydrate, that will allow me to lose weight, which of the two would you prefer?
I would warn them on any diet that was extreme because the chances of it succeeding is low. I think that, that Dr. Ornish would agree that it is difficult for a lot of the segments of this country to reduce the fat to the extent that he's recommending and replace it with healthy, whole foods.
Gary, can Americans lose weight?
Conceivably.
What percentage of people watching this show who are overweight, and by the way, overweight means they're more than 20% of their body mass predicted weight, what percentage of those people should be able to lose weight and keep it off?
Again, we don't have the data. What we know is that low-fat studies, low-fat trials and low-calorie, low-fat, low-calorie diets apparently do not work. And that's everyone's.
That's not true. And
it is. Excuse me, Barbara. There was recently a meta-analysis, a term used earlier, meta-analysis, when you look at a lot of studies and combine them together and see maybe each study by itself wasn't particularly definitive, but when you combine them together, you can get more numbers and get more of a clue. The Cochrane collaboration, which is an independent group that just does these kinds of reviews of data and preventive measures, they recently came out with a study in February and March showing that they had looked at low-fat, low-calorie diets, and that they simply tend not to work. And I think most of us in our experience know that when we go on those diets, we're hungry all the time. People fall out. As Barbara herself said, people don't stay on diets.
People don't stay on extremes. And Gary, you have to admit, because you're a physicist, you can't defy the second law of thermodynamics.
Well,
if a person eats less calories than they burn, be it low fat or high fat, they're going to lose weight.
Can we clarify the second law of thermodynamics issue? And I'm not a physicist, by the way. I studied in college. Had I been a good physicist, I might be a physicist now. I wasn't. That's why I'm a journalist. Okay? The point, the whole calories in, calories out, everyone pretty much acknowledges that this is the key. If you eat more calories than you expend, you're going to get heavier. Again, the question is, what if there's some aspects of the foods we eat make us hungrier? So the reason we eat more, the reason heavy people that we see on the streets eat more or eating constantly, it's not because they lack willpower, they've been brainwashed by commercials on television, but they are physiologically hungrier than those of us who appear to have willpower and are thinner. And the counter-argument, the counter-hypotheses that, again, I was claiming has simply not been tested for the past 25 years, is there's something about carbohydrates and the way they interact with blood sugar and with insulin that actually makes us hungrier. And it also makes it easier for us to deposit the extra calories as fat and harder for us to burn the extra calories, burn that fat once we have it. So it could theoretically explain why the nation's getting heavier, why we all have such trouble losing weight but such ease gaining it. And the argument, once again, is it has to be tested. When you believe it's wrong, prima facie, you're not going to spend the money to test it.
But there are very good experimental data that address that issue. There are feeding studies that show that varying the amount of fat blindly, where people can't tell what they're eating, it has no effect on weight loss. What affects it is total calories, and those have been well established. The other thing that's been well established, there have been metabolic studies.
Back and look at that data.
Well, I recommend that you go back and look at it.
Again, Gary, I would like you to have the same precision in analyzing studies that support your point of view that you applied to other differing points of view. And the Cochrane Review is a perfect example of how you're distorting that. The Cochrane Review didn't say low-fat diets don't help you lose weight. They said they don't help you lose weight better than high-fat diets or calorie-restricted diets. And I would agree with that. The question is not, can you lose weight on a high-fat diet? Clearly you can. That's why Dr. Atkins is selling so many books. The issue to me is, are people mortgaging their health by doing it that way? And the data that we do have, as imperfect as they might be, indicate that they do.
The Richard Fleming study Let's talk about this. He took 26 people and he put them on a low-fat diet, okay? And then he scanned them. And at the end of the year, he said, lo and behold, 10 of those people turned out to be on a high-fat diet after all, and those were the people whose arteries was clogged.
Well, this is, I think, highlights one of the fundamental problems we have with any dietary studies. I don't know if anyone at this table, I suspect most of the viewers would not want to subject themselves to a year of controlled diets. Yeah. Let me ask you a quick question. Can you eat healthy at a fast food restaurant?
The best thing they can do in those restaurants is order the smallest of everything. That the portion size is 90% of the problem. If they would eat a small hamburger, small fries, and a diet drink, they really can come out with a salad, and they can come out with a reasonable
So we're going to play a game. We're going to go around the table and find out what everyone had today. Theoretically, you're following diets that you advocate. Then we're going to give everyone, literally, a sentence to articulate what they really want to get across to the audience. Because we need to, I think, condense this to something concrete that people can walk away from or sleep away from. Gary, what you have for breakfast, lunch, and dinner today?
Well, what should you have? I've had scrambled eggs and sausage and tomato slices for breakfast, and my message is simply that the establishment here, represented by our friends, is a little too dogmatic, and that we may never know the truth unless we acknowledge that there is a counter theory that has never been tested, and that theory, more and more people are beginning to accept parts of the theory as being legitimate, and that it could answer a lot of problems, and it could even make it easier for Americans to lose weight.
You should never give a journalist one sentence. Barbara.
Not a band. It's not a preposition.
For breakfast, I had whole grain cereal with blueberries, orange juice, and then they gave me a snack here, which was a bowl of oatmeal. And my message is moderation. Eat a wide variety of foods, natural foods, fruits, vegetables, whole grain products, lean meats, and lean low-fat dairy products. And if you want to lose weight, you have to have less calories, be it from fat or carbohydrate.
Dean.
I just am so reeling from the idea that I'm now the establishment, which is such an unfamiliar role for me. But anyway, and I also wanted to mention that I've been actually consulting with McDonald's and with Pepsi, because fast food restaurants understand what, that's a great thing about free enterprise, is if people want something, they will make it. They see the writing on the wall, and they are now interested in making more healthful foods that I think, hopefully, we could all agree with. In terms of what I had for breakfast, I had a bowl of blueberries, I had an egg white omelet, and it was good, And in terms of the one thing that I would like people to remember, I would say, when you can, I think we all agree that science is really helpful in sorting out conflicting claims. What Gary's article really talked about is what if, what happens if these studies, just as he said, what happens in an alternate reality if it turns out these are true? But you know what? They're not true. At least we don't know that they're not true. Let me be really precise. We don't know. There's no evidence that they're true at this stage. If it turns out to be true, I'll be the first to change my mind, but show me the data.
Wonderful. Well, I had nuts for breakfast and did an operation. My single recommendation would be activity that Barbara mentioned earlier. So when everyone who's lying in bed to get out of bed and do 10 quick push-ups and about 20 sit-ups.
Throw away the TV clicker.
And throw away the TV clicker. I want to thank you very much for joining this broadcast. It's been a tremendous amount of fun. Barbara, for representing the American Heart Association. Gary, for a very well-written article and very provocative. And for that, I thank you from the medical community. And Dean, again, wonderfully articulate, and thanks for taking the time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.